on that, and does a number of things. One is it has enhanced disclosures around conflicts of interest. It requires a period of time that if companies submit their proxies within a specified period, that they would then have 3 days to then have an interaction with the advisory firms as to what their policies and recommendations are. There's a follow-up period with that. If there's a dispute, the advisory firm then would have to have a hyperlink with a company statement where the company is actually going to put forward its case and its information. It would also disable pre-populated voting. And it would also, and finally, it also has enhanced, again, it reiterates the solicitation rules around false and misleading statements. Okay. So it's a pretty comprehensive guidance and proposal that tries to take a look at both sides of it. The complaints that have been expressed by issuers in the past have centered around, duopoly, around conflicts of interest, around the fact that that recommendations are not company specific. So a number of these different concerns are addressed in the guidance as well as the proposal.
Great, thanks. And so Pat, I want to get you in. So one of the big arguments against the proposed rules is that the investor community, the institutional investors, have not asked for this. So what's ISS's take on the rules? Like, do we really need to be doing this?
I mean, if you look at the actual comments that have been put in by real investors, not the ones sort of ginned up by the fake comment letters and the efforts to sort of herd people or stampede them into putting in politically motivated comment letters, I think the vast majority of investors, and that includes the SEC's investor advocate and the SEC's investor advisory committee, at least 2/3 of the members of that panel, have said that this is not the right proposal, that it does not reform the proxy system. In fact, it does not address the basic deficiencies, things like the lack of vote confirmation in the process, I think, and so I think by and large, investors have urged the SEC to go back to the drawing board, that this proposal, frankly, isn't fixable the way it's been constructed, I think, and the SEC should really go back and take advantage of the time that it has in order to re-vet this with investors and find out what their concerns really are and address those concerns rather than simply addressing concerns that have been voiced by the issuer community.
If I could just raise just a couple of points, too. One is, if you take a look at the proxy process, every participant in that process, but for the proxy advisory firms, are regulated. And if you take a look at any entities that are under the SEC jurisdiction, if there's any case of a duopoly, they're regulated. And if you take a look at, let's say, the financial analysts, from several years ago, where there was found to be conflicts of interest, there was an extensive ethical regime put in place, and they're regulated. So this is not outside the norm for the SEC to go down this.
Seeing an industry that could be, and currently is from our perspective at ISS at least, covered by the Division of Investment Management with our role as a registered investment advisor, a role that we've had as a RIA for more than 20 years.
So you would argue that the industry is being regulated?
Absolutely, I think, and some of the participants in the industry are not registrants with the SEC. They're still subject to the anti-fraud requirements, but they would not be covered by regular examinations. I think as a first step, the least intrusive step the SEC could do is say, let's take our existing regulatory regime, something that's tried and true, something that we're already paying for, instead of disrupting the entire regulatory structure and seeing if that would take care of any perceived problems that are out there related to issues like conflicts of interest or potential errors in reports. There is an existing regulatory regime that deals with the relationship between proxy advisors and the institutional investors who actually subscribe or contract with us to provide them for research. The comparisons to the securities analysts and to the credit raters is a wrong one. That is where corporations, issuers pay for the research, which is then provided to investors. The business model in our industry has always been the investors contract directly with proxy advisors, meet their needs, and we are monitored, and our performance is monitored not only by the SEC, but by our clients on an ongoing basis.
Just a couple of points there,
Sure.
too. I think one is the SEC just didn't decide didn't get up one day and decide, okay, we're going to regulate proxy advisory firms, right? If you go back to 2009, 2010, we had actually provided the CEO with Risk Metrics at the time, which was the parent of ISS, a proposal, a proposal for an Administrative Procedure Act type process where you'd have an open process where you could see all the input that's going in. But the SEC then had, in 2013, they had a roundtable. Actually, if you go back, they had a concept release around proxy voting in 2009, 2010. They had a roundtable in 2013. They came out with guidance in 2014. They had a roundtable in 2018 after the House passed legislation to regulate advisory firms. It didn't pass the Senate. So the SEC has been looking at this, throughout the last 10 years, and has made a decision. Well, if the advisory firms aren't going to change behaviors, which there may be some issues with, we're going to have to take this leap. I also find it a little odd that people have a problem with prohibitions against false and misleading information. That is what the SEC's solicitation rules are built around, and what the proposed regulation is built around. The reason why they're going down this road is that the advisory firms don't have a process for publishing information if there's a mistake or factual error. Companies have submitted 139 supplemental filings where there has been factual errors. CII claims that there are disputes of opinion. We would actually happen to disagree, because when you start to look at it, it's about things like ISS saying the CEO has missed multiple board meetings when in fact the CEO has made 100% of board meetings, or ISS saying a comp plan is discretionary when it's actually set on specific preset goals. So that's where the SEC has to put the guardrails in and then allow for the process to develop from there.
So let's talk about the errors, and because that is obviously one of the issues the SEC sought to address. I know there's clearly a difference. Some of it is that there's errors, and some of it is there's subjectivity. And so so I guess, Pat, do the errors occur, and if so, what is your view to the extent to which they're occurring, and what is the opportunity for companies to fix them?
First of all, we track errors when they occur. And if you look at over the last 2 years, that is 2018 and 2019, the error rate, that's material errors that led to a change in the recommendation, were less than 1% of all the analysis that we do. I think if you even accept on the face some of the lawyer lobbyist reports that have been done in the SEC's own recent examination of the letters that Tom was talking about before, the SEC filings, their rate comes out below 1% as well. I think it's actually below 0.5%. I think, and so to say that there's some sort of systematic market failure here is wrong. If we learn about an error on a factual basis, we'll issue a report to our clients, an alert that tells them that we've already issued, if we have our research to them and there's something that we want to correct, and we'll tell them whether it was material enough for us to make a decision to change our recommendation or not. That process works well. Our clients know about it. I think they're quite often able to on their own go through our reports and look for any errors, and we do learn about them from our clients sometimes as well, or things that they'd like further explanations about. So there is a pre-existing process to deal for errors, but the idea that there's some sort of systematic breakdown and this justifies a new regulatory regime, and a very intrusive one that frankly would eat up about half the time that our clients currently have to examine, absorb engage with issuers if they want to, and then make their final voting decisions. And that's not going to lead to better decision making and better voting practices on the part of institutional investors. That's going to make it, again, a rushed process at the end where, frankly, they're going to end up doing a worse job rather than a better job.
And so, what is the timeline? Because the SEC's proposal is 3 days. So between the time where the proxy is filed and you do your analysis and get them, what is our timeline here? You don't want to rush the process, but how much time do your clients actually have to review this? And
yeah, I mean, our process is, very efficient. What we have is one group of employees that will pull all the data out of our proxy statement and other SEC filings that are necessary for us to analyze all the proposals that show up on a ballot under our benchmark policy, under our specialty policies, the whole range of policies that we use, and then also those items that would trigger one of our clients' custom policies, the policies that they've actually provided to us to apply. And then we'll take that information, an analyst will get it, they'll look at that information, they'll look through the proxy statement, they'll say, well, I need more information from an issuer. So we'll proactively reach out quite often to an issuer and say, we looked at your comp plan, we really don't understand this particular provision. Could you give us some help in understanding that in greater depth? We'll take that information back in-house. We'll come out and we'll put together our recommendation that'll get vetted internally, I think, by several layers of review, I think. And then for large market cap companies, in this case S&P and the US S&P 500, there is a limited window available for a fact check of that report. I think we do that on a voluntary basis, I think, in large measure because those companies are most likely to have very complex, especially compensation arrangements on their ballot. They're also much more likely than your typical company to be willing to make changes, either in their disclosure practices or in their substantive governance practices that would enable them to satisfy the concerns that we have. I think, and so we think that does benefit our clients, but simply mandating that process and throwing it out to every public company will definitely cut into the amount of time that we have not only to analyze the issues, but the amount of time that our clients will have to look at what we've recommended and to make a truly informed voting decision. And worse than that, it really stops them from being able to go out after they've got a recommendation and talk directly with the issuers themselves to see if they want to support management and reject our recommendation.
So a financial analyst who doesn't interact with the company just makes industry-wide pronouncements isn't going to last 5 minutes on Wall Street, right? So when you take a look at the inputs that ISS has, first off, yes, they do have a process with the S&P 500 and the like. Sometimes they only have 24 hours to respond. The other 3,700 public companies don't have that opportunity. And we've done over the last, since the 2014 guidance came out, we've been doing an annual survey in conjunction with NASDAQ, where we've been tracking what the company interaction is with ISS and Glass Lewis. And what you find over the course of time was there was a bump up in companies trying to interact with ISS and Glass Lewis, and then that has just been steadily going down because companies are not having that ability to have that dialogue. So you're seeing where a vast majority of requests for meetings are being rejected. And even then, companies aren't finding that interaction is necessarily being productive. Our hope here has been, and it's frankly, even with that proposal we submitted 10 years ago, is that not that that companies are just going to come in and say this is the way it is and that's the way it should be. It's more of have that dialogue where there's that back and forth. There's an understanding of what the specifics are the company's facing, what the trend lines are, what the strategies are, who the team is, and then making your recommendations based on that. Some of them may be changed. Some of them probably could also be adverse to the company as well. But by having that dialogue, ISS and Glass Lewis are actually going to be much better informed to make recommendations for their clients. Our view of, in studying the supplemental filings and the errors, it's probably closer to 2.5% error rate. Even CII, when they looked at it, even admitted that the supplemental filings are only the tip of the iceberg. Most companies don't even bother to issue supplemental filings because they don't necessarily think it is worth it based upon the weight that ISS and Glass Lewis has. So if you're talking about the proxy advisory firms as being a fiduciary, which ISS in its letter back to the banking committee a couple of years ago said it in fact was, a 2.5% error rate is a very significant number, particularly when you take a look at the fact that ISS's clients cast 8.5 million shares, 8.5 million ballots and 3.8 trillion shares. That is what makes them, as well as ISS, a de facto standard setter of corporate governance, and why there needs to be a rebalancing of the playing field.
Extrapolating off of the supplemental filings is a ridiculous claim of 2.5%. There's no valid evidence to back up that claim, I think, and it's hard for me to sit here and have sort of Tom talk about our process, because we have a lot of back and forth with issuers right now. We do engagement with them during the off season. I think we meet them at conferences. We spend a lot of time dealing with some of the trade groups and associations to understand where issuers are coming from on these topics. I think, and so we view engagement as a year-round activity to get their guidance. We include issuers and their representatives in our annual policy survey when we're putting together what our policy changes are going to be for the upcoming proxy season, and we also include them in some of the policy roundtables that we do mixed with our institutional clients. I think we get a lot of great feedback from issuers, I think, and the problem is that proxy season is concentrated. The vast majority of the meetings take place during a 2-month time period. I think to the extent that we have time available for engagement during that concentrated proxy season, we're going to have to put the resources where they're going to be of the most use to our clients. So the S&P 500 are the most widely held. As I said before, they have the most complex voting issues on their ballots, and a greater willingness to discuss potential changes that you want to make. I can tell you the current review process with the S&P 500 is not something. It's made by hand. It's one-on-one conversations. It has nothing to do with something you could basically take technology and apply to it and expand it over a much larger range of companies. And so we estimate that we currently, for Russell 3000 companies, try and get our research out. And we do get our research out about 20 days before the meeting date to give them adequate time to analyze the underlying issues, look at our recommendations, engage with issuers if they want to. And we estimate right now that it would cut 9 to 13 days out of that process by having to go through the multiple reviews for issuers, I think, and then also responding to that, I think. And so our clients would end up getting, in some instances, the research within 10 days of the meeting date, which would not give them adequate time to go through their own internal processes of looking at the underlying issues, engaging with corporations if they want to, and making an informed voting decision.
Because the SEC's proposal is like the 3-day rule, the inclusion of the hyperlink to help investors. Do you think that would go a long way to helping companies?
No, I think the SEC rule is actually trying to do a couple of things, right? It actually allows for the advisory firms to do their research, to come up with their recommendations, et cetera. But then also to have the institutional investors, their clients, also make sure that it is conforming with their fiduciary duties. The 3-day period in the hyperlinks are important because it will force and have a process in place that there is some interaction going on, which doesn't necessarily happen. Because even, we may not be happy, let's say, with the processes that ISS has. But ISS does have some ability to have some dialogue. Glass Lewis, not as much, right? If any, right? So one is to set a standard for that. The hyperlink is important as well. One is, look, if there's a difference of opinion, you can have both. You can have both out there, and you can make your decision, right? If there's a factual error, well, then you're going to have that information, and you're also not going to allow the pre-populated voting to go on. One example of a company was that they discovered a material misstatement of fact that occurred in a window of time where, even though I think ISS was informed, ISS at that point couldn't even come out with information. The problem then became that company then went to their institutional investors, informed them of that material misstatement of fact, and then, which they agreed was a problem. The institutional investors then tried to switch their votes, which they weren't able to do 100% because of pre-populated voting, right?
Okay.
So they were able to get about 60 or so percent switch, but not 40%. So you have 40% pre-populated robo-voting that was already put in there before this information was even out there. So the hyperlink actually will also help course correct if there are material misstatement of facts, and will actually also have the institutional investors have to take a look at that and make a final decision.
Again, you can vote multiple times if you're institutional investors. Material misstatement of fact is what Tom's talking about, the voting process itself. Our clients, if they get additional information, if we provide alert to them, even if they've already voted, they can go in and vote again and change the actual vote decision that they've made. The fact that this idea of robo-voting out there and it stops you from having any choice in the process, that is a complete and utter fabrication. I think all we're really talking about in terms of efficient voting processes is a lot of investors have a process in place where they say, provide us with a recommendation, give us some time to look at that recommendation, and we'll tell you whether we want to reject that recommendation, and if we don't reject it, then you can go ahead and put that vote into place. That just makes the process much more efficient from their standpoint. It does not eliminate any ability for them to go in and change a vote that they've already cast. The way corporate proxy voting works is the latest in time ballot that is received is the one that is going to count. I think, and so they're going to look at not multiple votes by the same institution, but what was the last vote that they cast. I think.
We would say that robo-voting is not a figment of anybody's imagination. In fact, in the last survey, the Chamber NASDAQ survey that came out showed that for an adverse ISS recommendation, within 48 hours of that recommendation being made, 40% of the vote comes in tracking exactly where ISS is. 10% of the vote comes in tracking what a Glass-Lewis adverse recommendation is during the same time period. So you are seeing that automatic voting happen that actually backs up with other information, with the Stanford University study, whatever, showing that ISS and Glass-Lewis together control about 38% of the vote. Even anecdotally, talking with companies, they will talk about in that first 24 to 48 hours, at least a third of the vote coming in and 95% of that tracking whatever the proxy advisory firm recommendation are. So there is sufficient evidence out there that this is an issue, and that's why we think the hyperlink, as well as disabling pre-populated voting if there's a problem, will actually force the institutional investor to relook at that information, then make a decision. Now, the issue is as well, when you take a look at institutional investors, the largest institutional investors have independent systems where they decide how they're going to vote, right? So ISS and Glass-Lewis reports are one basis of information for how they're going to decide how to vote. So that's BlackRock, Vanguard, Fidelity, et cetera, right? When you get below that, that's where things start to change, where you do have some institutional investors that are just going to completely rely on what ISS or Glass-Lewis are coming out with, so they may not be necessarily taking a look at that. And that is exactly what the SEC guidance as well as the SEC rule are also telling the institutional investors of, you just can't farm this out, you can't outsource this. You need to still be an active participant and check on how this is going and ensuring that it matches up with the fiduciary duty. Because as Commissioner Roisman said, the fiduciary duty here, right, the institutional investor at the end of the day is an intermediary. The fiduciary duty relates back to the individual who's putting their money into that fund for return. And that the corporate governance votes and policies need to ensure that that individual is getting that return that they need for their investment purposes.
Just let me respond to that.
Go right ahead.
Tom knows how to do a good filibuster. I think explaining how our voting process works. I think the vast majority of our clients, including almost all of the large ones, are what we call custom voting agent clients. That means they're not voting according to the ISS benchmark or House View recommendation. They are voting along the lines of a custom policy recommendation that we have made to them based upon their own internal proxy voting guidelines. I think, so the information that they're receiving says, these are the hot button issues for you, X, Y, and Z. I think, and so we have put forth a recommendation to them based upon X, Y, and Z that they said are the important items for them. They'll look at that recommendation, they'll go, ISS got it right or ISS got it wrong. I think, but to say that they should take 5 weeks to look at it at that point in time, well, that's their policy that's being applied. I think, and so what they'll do is they'll look at it and they say, did ISS misapply it? No. Do we need more information? If we do, we'll go out and talk to the issuer. Believe me, when we talk to our clients, one thing is clear: whenever they look into our platform and get on to vote a proxy, the first thing they look are where are the votes against management. I think, and those are the ones that they're going to zoom in on first, take a closer look at, see if they feel that we got it right, and that's direct feedback that we get from our clients. I think, and they can use hyperlinks in our reports to travel around and get to that information. I think, so the idea that somehow the ISS is guiding around these institutions when we're providing our clients with recommendations that are based upon the policies and guidelines that the clients have provided to us, not vice versa, is just a complete misrepresentation of the voter turnout that you're seeing in the early days following the issuance of our benchmark report that a lot of these institutions get as an informational source, but it has nothing to do with the actual recommendation that we're receiving. They're getting a recommendation that's based upon their policy, not ours.
Okay. Because I know that's an issue that the SEC asked for comments on whether it's something they should take up. I see we have a difference of opinion on that. Okay.
It's not a difference of opinion, it's a difference of facts. I mean, what I just told you is how the system actually operates, not our stylized view. I mean, that's the problem with the SEC's release, is everything is, well, this may be a problem, this could be a problem, this might be a problem. They provide no evidence of any market failures related to errors, related to conflicts, and yet they're asking to create this incredibly radical and invasive and potentially unconstitutional regulatory structure to deal with an issue where they haven't really provided any factual evidence that there's a real problem to solve.
I think for the SEC to wait for market failure is an abdication of their duty, and I think that's exactly what they're trying to avoid. We've lived through that. It's why we have Sarbanes-Oxley today. So I think the SEC is actually being pretty strong in trying to avoid a problem before it crops up. You know, the other issue too is if you take a look at custom policies, a custom policy could be follow ISS recommendations for everything except for X, right? That in and of itself is a definition of setting up a robo-voting system because you are pre-populating what you're going to support. And what the SEC is saying is go back and look at that and have that conversation with ISS and Glass Lewis to ensure that you're going to put the rights and the interests of the individual investor first.
So we've only got a couple more minutes, then I want to get the audience in here. So I do want to touch on the conflict of interest concerns, because that is a significant part of the SEC rule. And as I understand, so I think there's well, let me just go into, so there's claims of the conflict of interest because you have recommendations on proposals in front of the same company that you might offer a consulting service to. So I know you all have a firewall. Can you talk a little bit about how you mitigate, is there a conflict and how do you mitigate that?
Yeah, I mean, when I arrived at ISS back in 1996, I think, and there was already a corporate consulting business at that point in time. When I came to ISS, one of the first things I did and I came over from a competitor, actually, a company called the Investor Responsibility Research Center, and we've been a critic of ISS at that point in time. And the first job I was hired to bring in and do was to look at the firewalls and other protections that were in place to mitigate those conflicts and to put those into place. And that's what we did. We actually shut down the consulting service for a period of time, put those protections in place for clients, I think, and we proceeded since that point in time to go ahead and bolster that, including getting guidance and good guidance from the SEC as to how to enhance that. I think the problem is that part of what the ISS, part of what the SEC is suggesting that ISS do is actually to do damage to the firewall that we have in place now. I think to make it more likely that our analysts become aware of a potential relationship with our corporate consulting unit. I think, and so as a result, I think they actually are weakening the firewall rather than strengthening it. Right now, any institutional client on that voting platform I talked about before, when they go and they bring up a particular company, they'll see whether there is a potential conflict involved with that company. They can go and investigate it, click through and see what the nature of the conflict is. Our individual research analysts, though, can't see that information, so they're shielded on the other side of the firewall from knowing about those client relationships on the corporate side. I think, and so we actually have full disclosure to our institutional clients about the relationships we have with any issuers. There's no materiality standard. If they purchase $1 worth of corporate business with our ICS unit, that's going to get reported out. I think it's going to explain what they purchased, how much they paid for it, and so forth. I think, but putting that on the cover of our report, as the SEC is suggesting, actually blows a huge hole through that firewall, because it then puts that information in front of our analyst, who, when the next year they're going to pick up last year's analysis and the year before that, and it's going to say right on the cover there, oh, this person has purchased corporate services before, and so it actually weakens the protections against conflicts rather than strengthening them. I think, and so we have myriad protections against conflicts built into our process. I think, and I think they've been very effective. There's never been any instance where there's been any question that a conflict came to bear that led to a change in our recommendation that went against the interest of our institutional clients. And like I said before, these services have been going on for more than 20 years.
Well, there are three conflicts, right? But with the first one, with the firewall is a little leaky. 58% of companies that have had some sort of adverse recommendation from ISS the year before get a call from their consulting service effectively saying, we can help you get a better score next time. So that is very troubling, and that is a pattern that happens year after year after year. In fact, we've submitted, and others have submitted emails from member companies with those communications. Glass Lewis has a separate set of conflicts in that where they're owned by two activist investor funds. So we have actually written to the SEC and the Department of Labor before, where you see a pattern where a director slate is proposed, a competing director slate is proposed day one. One of those two investors that are the owners of Glass Lewis come out in support of that director slate day two. Glass Lewis recommends in favor of that competing director slate on day three. At a minimum, that's an appearance of a conflict of interest. Third, neither one discloses if a shareholder proposal proponent or a competing director slate proponent is a client. And that is something that the voting public should be aware of. So we think it is important that the SEC is finally addressing these issues.
What are they proposing?
Let me address this, though. Again, all Tom has to do is visit our website. We have fully spelled out all the process we have in place for managing every type of conflict that we have. We do have a policy that looks at shareholder proposal proponents who maybe are a client on the voting side, I think, and we apply a materiality standard. If the argument is that we're going to put a thumb on the scale because they're a client, we're going to look at how much revenue comes from that client. And if a client produces more than 5% of our revenues on an annualized basis, we will disclose the fact that the shareholder proposal proponent is a institutional voting or other data client on the investor side with ISS. Likewise, we have policies spelled out for dealing with conflicts from our private equity owner. We have policies that are there. I mean, the biggest potential conflict for any proxy advisor is the fact that most of our institutional investor clients are owned by or in of themselves are public companies themselves that we will opine on, I think. And believe me, there's clients that we regularly opine on that pay us enormous amounts every year, I think, of money, I think. And so that's the biggest, potential conflict that's out there. The SEC and doesn't need to address this issue because ultimately these clients, first of all, if they account for more than 5% of our revenues, I think we will go ahead and provide that disclosure like we would for a shareholder proposal proponent, I think, applying that materiality standard. But the nice thing is we're so large, and we've had clients literally walk away before because they said, you voted against our parent company board, we didn't like that, so we're going to pull our business from you. And we just sort of said, go ahead, because we're not going to change our recommendation simply because you're a client. We're going to apply it consistently across the entire universe of companies that we look at it.
So what is it the SEC is proposing to, how are they proposing to address the conflicts in the rule?
One is through disclosure. Two is through interaction between the institutional investor and the proxy advisory firms. But to go back to a point that Pat made, first off, the issue of the shareholder proposal proponent, that should be disclosed. That was something that was brought up by Damon Silver in the 2013 roundtable. It wasn't even the chamber that raised that. That he said that was an appearance of a conflict of interest. And even there, with the process you've described, Pat, it's a subjective process where you're going to decide whether or not it's going to put a thumb on the scale or not, whereas that information should be out there and then people can make that decision.
I guess it's a couple issues there. First of all, the vast majority of shareholder proposals are offered by institutions or individuals who are not our clients. I think so. A very small percentage of our clients have ever offered a shareholder resolution or probably intend to going forward. So it is much of a tempest in a teapot. It's not much of an issue, I think. But from a business standpoint, I think unless there's a true conflict involved, you're asking a company to basically publish, in essence, what we charge our institutional clients. I think so our competitors can come in and see how much an institutional client is paying. Different customers can come in and see what other customers are paying us, I think, and use that in negotiation. So you're taking what in essence is contractual proprietary information and forcing that information into the public realm. I think based upon a specious claim that somehow this is impacting the independence of the research without providing any evidence that it is.
Well, with that, I think I covered all the issues that. Well, let me open it up for questions. I think we've got some folks with mics. I don't know if we need them, but right here up in the front.
Thank you. Brandon Reese, AFL-CIO. My question is regarding the SEC's regulations and their impact on competition for proxy advisory services. The proxy advisory business is characterized by economies of scale and very low margins. And the SEC's burdensome proposed requirements for proxy advisors is likely to push out smaller proxy advisors out of business and create new barriers to entry for additional competition to come into this market. My question is, when the independent proxy advisors that my organization's pension plans use for casting votes go out of business because of these new burdensome regulations, including the fact that issuers will be allowed to review not once but twice the votes that they intend to cast on behalf of their clients as fiduciaries, who should we turn to for proxy voting? Should we always vote with management, or should we cement the monopoly system of ISS and turn over our clients, our pension plans votes to ISS? invite your comments.
Sure. No, thank you for the question. First off, you have two firms that control 97% of the market, right?
That's not true, because my pension plans are more than 97, or more than 3% of the market, and we don't use ISS or Glass Lewis.
Well, based on previous data, based on data that has been put together, those two firms constitute the vast majority of the market. What we've seen in the past is that there have been attempts for other entrants to come into the market, such as PGI, Proxy, Mosaic, et cetera, and that they weren't able to make it. What I think what we are talking about here is to have a clear set of rules for this industry to operate. They're the only participant within the corporate governance ecosystem that is not regulated. So this is to have a clear set of rules of the road that will allow this duopoly to operate, but to operate in a fair way.
This proposal is anti-competitive. I mean, it's anti-competition in every way, shape, manner, and form. We've seen in the comment process some of the global proxy advisors saying that if this goes in place, they'll never enter this market because it would be cost-prohibitive to them to deal with the regulatory structure that would be created. I think the barriers to entry right now are actually fairly low. I think if you just want to compete on the research side, offering research and providing recommendations, I think if you've got an internet connection and a computer, you could get into that business right now. I think going forward, you'd have to have a team of lawyers. I think you'd have to have a huge staff to deal with the review process. You'd have to have a team of lawyers to put confidentiality agreements in place with every issuer that you're providing your draft research to. I think it creates a nightmarish process without any justification provided by the records that are on the facts that are on the record. I mean, Tom loves to bring up all these anecdotal results, I think, but you're looking to change a process. You don't change a process based on anecdotes. You change a process based upon hard evidence of significant existing problems in the marketplace, and the SEC has completely failed to do that. And beyond that, they provide no meaningful cost-benefit analysis. If this was any industry being attacked other than proxy advisors, you would see Tom's quad squad of lawyers out there running over to the courtroom saying that, this is no cost-benefit analysis, arbitrary and capricious. I think they'd be screaming at the top of their lungs. I think, so this is all about the fact that we represent institutional investors, Tom represents corporations, and there's always going to be dissonance or disagreement between the two groups. I think it doesn't mean we have confrontations with issuers. It just means that we're representing our institutional clientele, and we have fiduciary responsibilities under the Investment Advisors Act to do so. I think, and Tom is representing the companies that pay him the big bucks to lobby and to try and change regulation and legislation. Everybody's doing their job here. I think, but don't forget who's representing whom. I think because it is definitely a case where the corporations are trying to put this structure in place to protect quote-unquote investors, and the investors are saying we don't need the protection that you're talking about.
A quick follow-up question. Tom, you mentioned stock analyst research reports. There's also potential for errors in stock analyst research recommendations, whether my pension plan should buy or sell company stock. Should companies pre-review that research recommendations before it's issued to my pension plans to decide how they should vote? And if so, wouldn't that create conflicts of interest, precisely the kind of conflicts of interest that we saw prior to Sarbanes-Oxley in the stock analyst community?
Those financial analysts have extensive discussions with companies to understand what the company's trend lines are, what their positions are, what their strategies are. That is how they understand it. Unfortunately, with proxy advisory firms, they don't do that. They come out with industry-wide or in some cases corporate governance-wide recommendations that don't look at company specifics. So it's not a matter of a conflict of interest. It's a matter of being informed.
It's about analyst
What I would actually say is that what you have with the hyperlink, as I said before, is you're allowing for both sides to have some sort of information out there, and then letting the public to decide that.
There's been no indication that investors are incapable of going on to Edgar and pulling down supplemental filings that have been offered by companies. I think no one on the institutional side has said this is a problem. Frankly, our own analysts, every time we're going through the review process, including after we issue our report and recommendation, we'll go through, and if a supplemental filing shows up and we think there's meaningful information in it, we'll issue an alert to clients and we'll say, hey, there's some interesting stuff you might want to take a look at. It did or didn't change our recommendation, but we think it's worthwhile taking a look at it because it adds to the mosaic of information that's out there. But forcing us to put that information via the hyperlink, I think, again, is appending something onto a report on a forcible basis by the government, allowing a third-party entity and empowering them to do it. It's sort of like deputizing a third party to go out and enforce the SEC's rules, I think, and that's strange territory. And again, to reemphasize the difference between securities analysts, I think, and the sell side research and the credit raters and ISS is that our process is one where the investors contract with us for the research. In the other instances with credit raters, that's being paid for by the issuer and being provided to the investment community. So the fact that there's back and forth in that process reflects the fact that the model is a non-independent model to start with. We're covering a company because it shows up in one of our institutional investors' portfolios, not because we were picked by the issuer to cover that company, which is the case with the credit raters.
I'd love to see how many alerts you put out for the 139 supplemental filings we've talked about before. So I mean, there's not necessarily a process in place for that, but I'd love to see how many of those actually that occurred.
Tom, since you love anecdotal evidence so much,
no, Pat, I'm sorry. I have to take exception with that because I've talked about the survey we came out with NASDAQ. I've talked about the ACCF study. I've talked about a number of different studies, not anecdotal.
It's completely anecdotal. You're
Pat,
looking at supplemental
Pat,
filings being made by companies.
The other issue is, no, come on, Pat. Those are actual filings made with the SEC. That is not anecdotal.
When they indicate
Pat,
differences of opinions with a proxy advisor's recommendation.
I find it very curious why companies are held to a standard where they cannot put out false and misleading information, yet when that same standard is being applied to proxy advisory firms, there's a problem there. I really don't understand that. And then lastly, with robo-voting is a problem because people are pre-populating their votes before they look at anything, and in most cases they don't look at anything if they're doing that. So that means that they're not looking at the information that there could be a material problem with. That is an issue.
Our regulatory structure now is that we're a registered investment advisor. We owe duties of loyalty and care to our institutional investor clients who purchase the research from us, including requirements that we do not provide false and misleading information in our reports. I think that is already subject to oversight by the SEC, I think, given our status as an RIA. If they want to have us do additional things, I think, to provide additional disclosures, they can do so. But to act as though there's no regulation currently in place, and regulation in the proper form, that is between the group that contracts us for us with that for that research and the group that pays us for that research, and not inserting issuers into the middle of that process. I think because I think issuers want to be in that middle of the process because they know they had a much greater ability to influence sell-side analyst reports because they were paying for that research to pick and choose the particular credit rater that they were using based upon who they thought they'd get the better opinion from. I think, again, let's don't adopt a system that has been shown to be fraught with problems and to replace one that is based upon a fiduciary client and provider relationship which is currently governed by an existing regulatory structure.
So are there any other questions from the audience before we close things out? Yep.
Thank you. James Andrus, CalPERS. Are we premature in talking about this because the SEC hasn't completed its plan with regard to proxy advisors, given that on page 59, it suggests that the details of the plan will be determined by the proxy voting advice businesses and the 5,000 plus registrants. And so in looking at it, it appears to me that there are a number of details that are not addressed because of the complexity of what they would have to impose. And So the question I have for you is that, can you come up with a plan, proxy advisor, with the 5,000 registrants that would express the details of the process that the SEC has outlined?
The existing review process that we have with S&P 500 companies is not scalable. It just simply isn't. That's the basis of our projection that it would add that significant amount of delay and erode our delivery time to our institutional clients. I mean, I don't want to get into the nuances of the SEC's proposal because there are so many unanswered questions there, but I mean, right now we get a number of clients that sign up for our review in the S&P 500, and they provide no comments whatsoever. All they want is a little sneak peek at the actual research itself. I think now, if companies did that at the large end of this, if they filed for the 5-day delay, I think, and then the 2-day delay on top of that, I think, and then provided no substantive feedback to the proxy advisor whatsoever, all they've done is delayed the process to get a sneak peek at the actual revote recommendation, I think, and to get a head start in responding to it through their own filings. I think there's been no talk about providing some sort of requirement for issuers if they avail themselves of this process, that they actually take it seriously, I think, and don't just use it to delay the delivery of the process of the product to our institutional clients who have paid for it and want it early on so they can spend time looking and delving into it and engaging with issuers if they want to. I think there's also, I cannot recall a situation where an issuer corrected something that was in their favor in one of our reports or contested a positive recommendation that we had made to them. Would there be a duty on issuers that if they do participate in this process to correct errors that were in their favor? I think, because we've never seen them do it before, or in fact to go ahead and in situations where they found errors, would there be a duty on them to actually bring them to our attention, I think, or could they just sit silently by and let the clock tick and go ahead? And don't forget, during this time period, the companies are not in the penalty box. We are. We can't provide our research to our clients, but the issuer can go out and try and get that client to vote before they receive the research. In other words, oh, nothing wrong here, go ahead and vote. You know, we need your vote in. That we're going to solicit you over and over again to try and get you to vote before you've ever received the research. I think, and that's not a good change to the system, and reducing the amount of time that institutions have to analyze the research, to digest it, to engage with issuers. It's just a bad idea, and I don't think, frankly, it can get fixed. I think, again, slowing down the research by, anywhere from 45 to 65%, I think, is not going to lead to better results in the voting process.
Well, I think also, I mean, first off, this is an outgrowth of, concept release, 2 round tables over the last 10 years. So again, this is not just something that has just suddenly been sprung upon anybody. But I think what the SEC is also doing, both with the guidance as well as with the proposed rule, is setting up a series of guardrails for how proxy advice should be, how the industry should operate, but also then, very importantly, leaving it between the advisory firms and their clients to develop the processes and measures that they need to perform their functions. Because advisory firms, at the end of the day, perform a very important service for the corporate governance ecosystem. And with the way that institutional investors now invest, it is important that they have that interaction. What we're saying, it just should be a fair and balanced system.
What Tom wants to do is what a lot of CEOs want to do, is turn back the clock. There was a time when the Wall Street rule ruled. If you didn't like the way a company was being run, you sold your shares. Well, a lot of investors can't do that because they're indexers, they're passive, and they can't sell the securities. And a lot of them have simply decided, I like this company, and I like the underlying business, and I don't want to sell my shares, but I do want to change things. I think, and again, to simply dismantle a system that has enabled institutional investors to vote in accordance with their fiduciary responsibilities to please corporate CEOs who don't like dissent is just turning back the clock to a time when the market, frankly, was going sideways and shareholder value was being wasted.
A system where we've had half the companies, public companies, than we did 25 years ago, is a system that isn't working.
And with that, I think we'll bring everything to a close. Thank you all for joining us today. This was a great conversation, I'm going to say. And so we do hope, BPC intends to hopefully submit comments on the proposed rules before they close next week, I believe. So hopefully this informed some of you if you're still planning to submit viewpoints. And there's issues about, you know, the end comments there about the companies and their interaction with shareholders and stakeholders. That is going to be the centerpiece of our project going forward. So keep an eye on our website and social media for more information on what we're doing in this space. But thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking our panelists.